In this problem, we're asked to calculate for each supplier how long it takes on average to receive order items. And we're going to be doing this at the line item level. And I'm going to show why that is in just a second. We're also supposed to calculate how many orders we have placed with each supplier. And this is at the header level. And then also how many unique items we order from each supplier. So let's take a look at the ERD diagram to determine which tables we will be needing and how to relate these tables. So we need to determine the time, how long it takes between when we order and when we receive an item. So here's the order date. So we're going to need the purchase order header and the order date. We're going to need the receiving report header and the receiving date. So now we're going to compare the order date and the receiving date and take an average of those. We also need to be able to compare these two somehow, and there's no way of relating the purchase order header to the receiving report header because the receiving reports are done at the item level. So we need information about the items. So we're going to have the purchase order line item and the receiving report line item level as well. So we're going to say for a specific line item, what was the order date on that line item? And then we're going to compare the receipt of that specific line item to the receiving date for that line item. And then also we're going to be looking at how many unique orders have we placed with each supplier, and also how many different stock items, unique stock items, have we ordered from them over time. So that's the goal. So we need these 4 tables then. And to simplify a little bit thing, I think I'm going to structure this as a subquery where I join these two together to kind of create a purchase table, a virtual table almost, and then another table where I'm creating like a receiving report table. However, I need to be careful here when I'm going to be doing the aggregation here to determine how many purchase orders I have placed with each supplier. When I'm joining these, I'm going to get each row in here is going to be associated potentially with many rows in here. So I can't just do a count of purchase order IDs later. I'm going to have to use the distinct keyword or maybe do some sort of grouping and counting where I group based on purchase order ID in another subquery. But I'm thinking the distinct is probably going to be easier. All right, but let's start working. And so again, I'm going to start by creating a subquery for this and then a subquery for this. So let's see, we said I'm going to select, and I'm going to select from the purchase order header table. I'm going to call that A, and I'm going to join that. I'm going to join that with the detail purchase order line item details, and I'm going to call these A and B. And since these are going to be in a subquery, I'm going to do SA and SB to distinguish that from the outer query aliases. I'm going to join these two, and let's go back to the ERD diagram. I'm going to be joining them on the purchase order ID. And from these two tables, I do need the purchase order ID because that's how I'm going to find out how many purchase orders I have placed. I'm going to need a stock item ID because I need to figure out how many different items have I ordered. And I also need a stock item ID later to join together with the receiving report items. I need the order date so I can calculate how long it takes to receive orders. And I need the supplier ID because I'm going to be grouping based on supplier ID. And let's see, the supplier ID will be in A. And also notice that the order date is actually in A as well. And the stock item ID is in B. And the purchase order ID is in either one of them. But I'm going to start with, I'm going to use it from here because it feels like that's more representing one row in here is one purchase order ID. But that is not super important. All right, so that's going to be one of my inner queries. So let's go ahead and run that to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. And by the way, I always do this. I run portions of my query. So I kind of build it that way. Not only do I make sure that the code actually works, but sometimes when I look at the output, I realize I missed something, some logical error I made too. So it's going to take a little bit of time to run. So this looks like it worked, right? So I have purchase order IDs now repeated for different stock items I'm ordered on that ID, and I have the supplier ID and I have the order date. All right, so then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, but with the receiving report items. So I'm going to copy this to make it a little bit quicker because it's going to follow the same structure. I'm going to change all the SAs to SC and all the SBs to SD. Okay, I think I got that right. It's no longer purchase order ID, it's now receiving report ID. To change that there, and also need to change that in the select statement. And then we're not pulling this from the purchase order header, we're pulling it from the receiving report header and from the receiving report line item. I am still pulling stock ID, but I'm not pulling order date anymore. I'm pulling the receiving date. And I don't need the supplier ID from this table. I only need that from one of the two tables. So let's see. So I have the information I need to join these two, which is going to be the, let's go back to the ERD diagram. So the ERD diagram is showing me that I'm going to be joining it based on the purchase order ID and the stock item ID. Stock item ID and purchase order ID. And if you notice here, this line here is slightly in between these two, meaning I'm pulling from both these fields. And again, interpreting this is saying that each line item can have 0 or more receiving report lines, and each receiving report line can have one and only one order line. So we have a couple of problems here. One is dealing with what do we do with if there is a line item here that does not have a receiving report line associated with it. Well, we're going to do an inner join, so we're going to exclude those. So we can't really calculate the difference between order date and receiving date unless we have a receiving date. So I'm going to be excluding those by doing an inner join. As far as having multiple receiving report lines, so the potential of having multiple receiving report lines for each purchase order lines, we're going to have to deal with that too. And we're going to do that by grouping receiving reports based on stock item ID and purchase order ID. And then we'll just take the average of the date, and then we can compare that average date to the order date. This, of course, doesn't kind of give me a weighted average or something where maybe I receive most of the order very quickly and then just parts of it later. But we're going to have to pretend that that will give us a reasonable solution. All right, so I said I needed to group this. So I'm going to say group by, and I need to group by stock item ID and stock item ID and purchase order ID. By the way, I need the purchase order ID here still. And I actually don't need the receiving report ID because I'm not going to be using that outside of this subquery. So let's see, I'm actually pulling that from the detail. So the purchase order ID is located here and not in, well, it's actually located in here too, but this is the one I need to use. So I'm linking it up here at this level. So now I'm going to be grouping based on these two. And then I'm going to take the average of the receiving date. And let's make sure that runs. So I'm getting an error message saying I can't average a date. So here we could go with the solution of just simply taking the last receipt of that item. So we could say last, or we can convert this receiving date, which is currently stored as a date value. And I simply can't take an average of date. But what I can take is of epic values. So I can calculate the number of seconds since 1970. So I can calculate the number of seconds since 1970 and then take the average of that. And then I either keep that as a epic data type or I convert it back into a date. But for now, let's go ahead and just change this to an epic. So I'm going to do an extract. Extract that from this, and then I should be able to average this. So let's make sure that works. And now we're getting a result. So again, this is the average in the number of seconds since 1970 of those receiving dates there. While it is possible to convert epic values back to dates, it's a little bit of a calculation that I'm going to avoid by then simply converting the order date to an epic 2, and then we can just simply compare those two values later. So let's go ahead and do that right away. So we're going to say extract here, and then we're going to extract from this, we're going to extract the number of seconds from that date from 1970. And that's what this does, and now that returns that extracted value instead. And let's save that as order date, and let's say this as receiving date. Actually, to avoid any confusion, let's do receiving date seconds and order date second. All right, so now we're done with the two subqueries. So now I'm going to have to join these two and then also select and do the other calculations that are needed. I'm going to go ahead and put parentheses around these. And I'm going to call this A. And I'm going to call this one B. And I'm going to have the select statement up here. And then this one is going to be, let's do star for now, so I have a placeholder. And then we're going to select from, and then we're selecting this entire thing. Let's do some indentions here. And then we're going to be doing an inner join, we said, between these two. I'm going to inner join this select statement. And this is going to be on A equals purchase order ID equals B purchase order ID and A stock item ID equals B stock item ID. We also know that we needed to run this for each supplier. We needed to show all these counts and averages. So I'm going to do group by here. And I'm going to group by supplier ID from the first subquery. And now let's go ahead and make sure this runs. So let's see. Okay, so I'm getting an error message here saying that a period purchase order ID must appear in the group by, and that's simply because I'm having a bunch, when I'm doing the store here, I'm getting purchase order ID, stock item ID, and all these other fields in here. And since I'm not grouping with them or applying an aggregate function to them, I'm getting an error message. Well, we don't want to be showing the purchase order ID. So instead of doing store here, I'm going to say a supplier ID. And now let's make sure the query runs, and that's looking good. Well, at least we're getting results, and I assume we have 7 suppliers, so I'm getting that correct at least. So now let's start looking here. What is it that I need? I need to calculate the average fulfillment time. So I'm going to add that to my select statement. I'm going to have quite a bit of long things here, so I'm going to place these in different rows. And then I need the number of orders, and I need the number of unique items. So the average fulfillment time is going to be the order date seconds minus receiving date seconds. Well, that's not quite in hours, that's in seconds, right? So I'm going to have to do something about this. And by the way, I also need to calculate the average of it. I'm going to go ahead and say ABG on this and average them. And I'm going to say that as. And let's deal with later how we change this from seconds to hours. But I just want to get this running first, and then we can look at it. Okay, number of orders. So here I'm going to do a count, and I'm going to be counting how many order IDs I have, because that represents orders. So we have purchase order ID here. However, remember that when I join these two tables, the purchase order table and the purchase order detail table, I end up, the header and the line item, I end up creating a number of repeated items for the purchase order header. So I don't, each purchase order ID is not unique in this subquery result set. So I'm going to have to do some sort of distinct here so that I only count unique purchase order IDs. And then similarly, when I'm looking at the number of items I have ordered from different suppliers, I don't mean that I have ordered how many times I've ordered different items. I mean how many different items have I ordered in total. So here again, I'm going to need a count and then a distinct. And here I'm looking for the stock item ID, and I'm going to pull that from, it doesn't really matter because I'm doing an inner join on them, but I'm going to pull it from the, since I'm talking about ordered items here, I'm going to do it from the A again. And that's going to be as. So now let's go ahead and see if this runs. See all this code. So let me go ahead and go down a little bit. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I made a mistake here because I have a negative number because I'm taking order date, which is of course sooner than the receiving date. So if I want to calculate how long it's taking, I need to look at the receiving date and then take away the order date, or I just put a minus in front of this to revert it. But I'm going to change this to be more logical. There we go. But again, I'm getting all these seconds here, so I need to adjust that somehow. But let's see, number of orders. This looks kind of reasonable, and we can check that these are correct by running a distinct on the order header table and finding out how many orders we have. Or actually just running the order header, so we can just do select star from order purchase order header and see how many purchase orders we have. So when I run that, I'm getting 2074 rows, and I'm just going to eyeball this, but I have a feeling that kind of makes sense. So do I have about 2074? Yeah, if I add all these up, they should add up to about that. I bet it's exactly that actually. All right, so now we need to deal with this whole seconds thing here. So I want to convert this to hours somehow. Well, we can just apply some sort of, so if I do divided by 60, I'm getting how many minutes I have. And then if I do another divided by 60, I'm getting how many hours I have. So if we go ahead and run this, got a syntax error because I ran 2 different select statements. So that's now looking better, more like hours. But I don't want this long stuff, so let's go ahead and round this to. I'm going to round that to 2. And when I do this, I'm going to get an error message. And I'm getting an error message saying there is no function for rounding double precision. So I'm going to have to cast the average here, which is a double precision. I need to cast that into as a number or a numeric field. So I'm going to go ahead and do numeric like this. And then we'll try it again. Let's see. So I do round. I'm going to put this around the whole average. Make sure I have numeric correct. That looks good. And now we ran. Okay. So now I'm getting how many hours was 2 decimal places as it take to fulfill the order. So for each supplier, what's the average fulfillment time? How many orders have we placed with that supplier? And how many unique items have we placed with that? This is kind of interesting. I have 15 unique items, but only 5 orders. So those orders must have contained quite a few items.